Welcome to episode 31, Acts 22 through 28. This is kind of the road to Rome, where Paul comes from Jerusalem to Rome. And I'm Farrell.
And I'm Pickering.
And we're just happy to be here, and we're just going to jump right in so that...
And this is like got the Gospel 5 of the 4 Gospels. We're at the very end
Acts,
of Luke's
testimony.
book of Acts.
Yeah, it's kind of the second book of Luke. Yeah. Okay, I kind of going to go back and tie it a little bit to where we were left off before. In Acts 18, we know that when they desired him to tarry longer with them up in the Caesarea and up through on his journey there to Jerusalem, and we had the prophecy that he was going to run into all kinds of trouble when he gets to Jerusalem.
From
anyway,
Agabus,
and they bade him farewell, saying that he bade them farewell, saying he must keep the feast and come to Jerusalem. And I find that fascinating, that even after Christ fulfilled the law of Moses, they still honored, or Paul especially still honored the appointed times, the festivals,
right,
which is a good marker that those appointed festivals are time markers, and he was honoring them all. And this is, he actually made a lot of effort to be there for Pentecost in this one, and that's fascinating. That Pentecost
to fulfill his vow.
Yeah, and Pentecost is the holy day for the Gentiles. You know, the 2 loaves of bread and the whole scenario. So anyway, so he sails from Ephesus and heads to Jerusalem. And then Paul took the men, and the next day purified himself with them, entering into the temple to signify the accomplishment of those days of his purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And this is the 4 that we talked about last time that was with him.
That went with him.
And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. So he's already running into persecution, and he's just almost barely got there.
Right.
And just went to the festivals. And we know that this festival is the one where they take the 2 loaves of leavened bread, and in Corinthians he talks about how that we need to purge out the old leaven, and you may be a new lump as ye are unleavened. And so he's saying that, hey, we need to become unleavened. And so
right, because
sin must leave us. In the
right, in the Old Testament, leaven is always a symbol of sin. And, you know, we often read the woman that mixes the leaven in with the 3 measures of meal as if that's a good thing. But if you cross-reference the 3 measures of meal, that was the peace offering. And if, you know, to mix leaven, a symbol of sin, in with the peace offering would have, you know, made anyone that understood the temple offerings very, very upset. But again, the leaven in the loaves here is a representative, it's a symbol that during this time when the gospel goes to the Gentiles, that even though there's leaven there, it's covered by the atonement of Jesus Christ.
And you remember that they take these 2 loaves, these big loaves, and there's a picture here of actually a recent reenactment in Jerusalem. They take these 2 loaves, which are made in the shape of an altar with the horns of the altar in the 4 corners, and they present it and wave it to heaven and to the 4 corners and everywhere. And this is what they do on Pentecost. So this would have been the time where Paul has made it back to Jerusalem. And he says, therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Meaning, he's saying, you know, this needs to become something more than just an outward symbol. The symbol, it has to be a symbol of the heart. And, of course, then we know from the last lesson that he gets taken actually by the Romans to protect him from the Jews.
Him, yes.
Because there's 40 who have taken an oath to kill him, and they the Romans actually rescue him from the Jews, because the Jews think he's brought a Greek or a into
The Egyptian.
into the temple and
Right, we're confusing all those stories. Yeah, the Egyptian is the soldier actually thinks that he's the escaped Egyptian.
oh yeah, but I'm
he's
talking
not.
the Jews
But
think
you were
it's
talking,
Timothy and yeah.
right, that those men from Asia are accusing him of bringing a Gentile into
Yeah,
the
a Gentile
temple.
into the temple, and that's got them all riled up. Anyway, so the Romans come and rescue him, pull him in, and they think he, like she just said, they think it's the
Escaped Egyptian.
escaped Egyptian. But anyway, so his first offer of what he has to say to them, and Rhonda left the cliffhanger there of what the
Right. Well, it leaves a cliffhanger there,
Yeah.
right at chapter 21. It's like,
which is kind of weird that we stopped then our reading
and Paul
right there.
said, comma, chapter 22.
Right, chapter 22, and that's where we start. Anyway, and so at that point, Paul's defense is he tells his conversion story. He tells of his vision. And he goes and he talks about how he saw the glorified Christ on his way to Damascus. And he tells his vision of what he saw, and the vision of Annas coming to minister to him, and the vision of God when he called him to minister to the Gentiles. And he recounts this tale in Acts 22.
And that's when they have the come apart, is when he's telling him this whole story. But then when he says that that the angel told him to take the gospel to the Gentiles, they lose it.
Yeah, well, but before that, he talks about how he even confesses his persecution of the believers, and how he had been a persecutor of the Christians, as they hadn't been named yet. He actually persecutes the believers in that situation.
I like what it says right there in verse 21. He said that after the Lord told him, "Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles." It says that they gave him audience unto that word. And then after that, they lifted up their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow, he's not fit to live." So
Yeah,
that's what they're upset about.
yeah, and they just start to come after him, and they actually make a pact that they will kill him. And somebody hears that pact. I'm trying to remember.
It's his nephew.
His nephew hears the pact and actually tells the Romans that they don't leave him unguarded, per se.
Right.
And anyway, so he has this vision when he's called to Macedonia in Luke, or Luke accounts in Acts 16:19. So we know that Paul has these visionary experiences similar to Joseph Smith, in a sense.
Right.
And that's actually really, really amazing, the similarities of their conversions to a degree. I mean, Joseph already believed in Christ, but at this point in time. And when the ministry was difficult in Corinth, God encouraged him by a vision. So he had many visions, actually. Paul was what you would call a visionary man.
Yeah, that's the one where they said, "Be not afraid to go and preach, even though they're getting ready to kill you." You know?
This is bad times, and so you have similarities that Joseph was a visionary man, Lehi was a visionary man. We have many of these of our dear progenitors that were very much leaving their testimonies of the powerful witnesses they experienced in vision. So after his arrest in Jerusalem, Paul was encouraged by a vision again. So he's encouraged in the prisons, and so he has many of these visionary experiences. And in the midst of the storm of sea, an angel appears to him and assures him that he and the passengers would be saved. That's later, and we're not quite to that point yet, but we're talking about these vision experiences that Paul experienced. And we know that Joseph Smith also experienced many visions. And along with these special visions related to his call, spiritual revelation and divine mysteries were also communicated to Paul. And the mysteries of the church itself. He tells us that in Ephesians.
And, I think it's in Ephesians when Paul says that, I love that he calls it, it's the fellowship. He calls it, And
You almost think Tolkien's took that, right?
right.
The fellowship.
Exactly. But the whole thing about the mystery of the church, when you think about it from the point of view of the Jewish people, this whole gospel going to the Gentiles thing was a hidden mystery for them, and that's exactly what Paul calls it in Ephesians. But I think sometimes that the whole part about the gospel going from the Gentiles and back to the house of Israel is a mystery part to us that are living here in the very tail end of the time of the Gentiles.
Yeah, we talk about the changing of the guard. And,
Exactly.
we find these times, these what I'd call the backstory, and we talked about that last time a little bit too,
Right.
where you have these 3 seasons of time of Israel, so to speak, and of the Gentiles in between.
And then the return to the house of Israel.
To the greater house of Israel, when it's Israel.
In the millennial day.
Yeah, the millennial day is going to be actually the greater house of Israel, where you have the 3 branches come back together.
And all the Gentiles that are numbered with them, right?
Yeah, numbering with them.
And
then they're all called saints.
Right, and back to Shavuot, to that festival, that appointed time that Paul's heading back for, those loaves of bread are intentionally huge. They're humongous loaves of bread, representing that huge
2,000 years of harvest of Gentiles.
Yeah.
So to speak. Yes, absolutely.
God will, in Acts 15, God will take out, quoting Amos 9, God will take out of the Gentiles for himself a people. That's just so beautiful that the Lord has planned to rescue.
The really beautiful part is
everyone.
that people is us.
Right.
Hopefully. I mean, we're signing on, right? It's us we're talking about here. That's the people.
Ephraim scattered among the nations,
exactly.
right?
It's us. It's us who have to be, as Hosea would say, finished baked.
Right.
We have to become full Israel by our covenant, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yes.
God also honored Paul by taking him into heaven 14 years earlier, in AD 43 approximately, between his departure of Taurus and his visit from Barnabas, if I said that right.
Right.
That story is kind of overlooked a lot. I think, at least for me, it was for many, many years, that he actually went into Arabia.
Right.
Kind of like unto Moses.
There's a 3-year gap there where he was instructed.
And he actually went and got instructed, much like unto Moses, when he went into Arabia, and most probably to Mount Sinai and the Rock of Horeb and all of those places, and spent his time of education on a grander scale directly with the Lord. And that is just, I'm hoping that someday maybe I can qualify for something similar and have an experience where God can actually just teach me by revelation the many, many things that...
In order to have been a student of Gamaliel, like Paul was, they were masters of the Torah. He knew it inside and out. And to think that he went to Mount Sinai and went to the place where the Torah was revealed, that just doesn't seem to be a stretch for me in my thinking of Paul.
We are guilty of wanting to go and
Who
see.
doesn't want to go to Mount Sinai?
And climb the mountain.
Exactly.
And we actually went and climbed the mountain, and that was such a joy. Such a spiritual experience, too. I mean, much of that it's hard to even talk about. Very strenuous for an old guy like myself.
For all of us that went, yes.
And it was one of those, I don't know, how do you even describe such a thing? It was one of those just sanctifying experiences to climb Sinai.
I think the thing that I found that was amazing is that every one of us that went up that mountain, it became a very individual quest to make it.
And yet a team.
And yet we were all together,
Yet it was,
but it was so extremely personal, and and a place where in the extremities of the desert and the lack of water and all of those conditions, you come face to face with God and the reality of your desperate need for Him in that place. And I think that's why the Lord brought the children of Israel into the wilderness there, into the desert.
So that they had to depend on him. But Moses too.
Yeah.
I mean, Moses would 40 days and 40 nights upon that mountain and had to be sustained of the Lord.
Right.
And I'm sure that Paul, having been there, I'm sure Paul had to be sustained by the Lord in those things. And so it's, I mean, from a personal experience, it's very, very sanctifying experience. It's a very humbling experience. It's a very, like she said, a very personal experience between you and God. Incredible. Hard to even know how to talk about. Jewish rabbis were accustomed to speaking about themselves in the third person, and Paul adopted that style in sharing this experience with his friends in Corinth, or enemies too, as far as that goes.
Everywhere he went.
Yeah, he became, I don't know, I think it's also a way to speak of things without drawing attention to yourself. I actually would love to adopt more of that skill that Paul adapted to. That being said, Joseph Smith has his experience of seeing the Father and the Son, and Paul has the experience of seeing the Son on the road to Damascus. And I think there's so many similarities in so many of these things, because you think about when Moroni came to Joseph into the room. Any of you who have been back to the Smith home in New York, you know that his brothers and sisters were in the same room with him, because they, you know, in those days they shared the upper room with the attic, and yet they didn't hear Moroni. So it's very much like the story that Paul accounts, where they seen the light, but his brothers and sisters would have been asleep probably. But I'm saying that the idea that sometimes people say, you know, that, oh, it couldn't be so. Daniel has a very similar experience, that the people with him don't hear the voice, whereas Daniel hears the voice. And so if people don't hear the voice, it's very patterned in Scripture that way. Almost everybody who has had a visionary experience like this, the people around them don't hear it.
Right.
They don't hear the voice and know it. But anyway, however, it was nevertheless a fact that I had beheld a vision. This is Joseph's testimony. And I have a thought since that I felt much like Paul when he made his defense before King Agrippa and related the account of the vision that he has had when he saw a light and heard a voice. But still there were but few who believed him. Some said he was dishonest, and others said he was mad, and he was ridiculed and reviled. But all this did not destroy the reality of his vision. He had seen a vision, and he knew he had. And all of the persecution under heaven could not make it otherwise. And you know that is true of Paul's life, because he was fearless.
Right.
I mean, he just went forward fearless. And same with Joseph. He just went forth
Well, he
fearless.
said that when Agabus told him not to go to Jerusalem, and he said, why would you weep and break my heart? I'm ready to go to Jerusalem to be in bonds and to give my life for
if necessary,
Jesus
whatever.
Christ.
So it just, Paul was on his mission, no fear. And Joseph was much in the same place. His mission was no fear. In fact, I remember the story later in Acts where it's talking how they say, you know, you're so much learned, Paul, that you're a madman. And more or less, he's talking about...
You're too smart for us. You must be crazy.
I have to laugh at that sometimes.
I know, right?
Because sometimes people have accused me to be too smart for my own good. And that's another story. But anyway, and I don't think that's really true. I don't know that I am too smart for my own good. I'm actually kind of dumb in some areas. But I find that when you boldly get out there, sometimes people start to think you're quacked in the head. But all this did not destroy the reality of the vision. He had seen a vision. He knew he had, and all the persecution under the sun could not make it, under heaven could not make it otherwise. And though they should persecute him unto death, yet he knew, and would know to his last breath, that he had both seen the light and heard the voice speaking unto him, and all the world could not make him think or believe otherwise. That's just, Joseph Smith is using Paul's testimony to echo his own.
Well, and I think it's beautiful because Paul is the one that would bring the gospel to the Gentiles, and Joseph Smith would be the one who brings in
The fullness
of the Gentiles.
yeah.
And so that they would have parallel experiences.
Yeah,
It's
and
beautiful.
it's beautiful. So you can imagine that Joseph Smith and Paul are study buddies, so
Well,
to speak.
you know that we have the physical description of
Paul by Joseph Smith.
by Joseph Smith, right?
Yeah, I know, it's incredible to.
He knew him.
Yeah, he knew him, and that's just incredible when you think about the whole story, and that's the beauty of it all. So it was with me. I had actually seen the light, and he's bearing the similar testimony. And in the midst of that light, I saw two personages, and they did really speak to me. In other words, this is the real deal. And I thought I was hated and persecuted for saying that I had seen a vision. And though I was hated and persecuted for saying that I'd seen such a vision, yet it was true. And while they persecuted me, reviling me, and speaking all manner of evil against me falsely for saying so, I was led to say in my heart, why persecuted me for telling the truth? I have actually seen a vision. And who am I that I can withstand God? And why does the world think to make me deny what I have actually seen? For I had seen a vision, and I knew it, and I knew that God knew it, and I could not deny it, neither dare I do it. Least I knew that by so doing I would offend God and come under condemnation. So their stories, like I said,
Well,
they're persecution buddies too.
Yeah.
I mean, they both experienced great persecution, and they both sealed their testimony with their blood.
I mean, this is what Paul does when he's standing on the stairs there, at that cliffhanger at the end of chapter 21, and when he goes into chapter 22, when he has the floor and they allow him to speek, he tells them of his testimony. He tells them that he saw
with conviction.
And you give them a first-hand account like this, and it puts you in one of two camps. You're either telling the truth or you're lying. And it's amazing to me how your own paradigm, your own box will determine whether or not you. Well, I guess probably the thing that we need to go back to is in the Book of Mormon, when Laman and Lemuel are telling Nephi, how come you got the answer? How come you understand Dad's vision and we didn't, and everything? And Nephi says,
did you ask?
Why do you harden your heart? Have you asked?
Yeah.
I mean, when we close ourselves off to where we won't even ask.
Because we think we know most of the time.
Like even when Paul was bearing his testimony, the minute he said Gentiles, whew,
yeah, that was a trip word for them. It's like they just, oh wow.
I'm supposed to bring it to the Gentiles, and then
they're like, ah.
Absolutely. I
Absolutely.
mean, what if they'd have asked?
Yep.
Lord, is it supposed to go to the Gentiles?
Right.
And
they probably would have got the answer if they'd asked in humility. In fact, I know they would. And when it was determined that we should sail, now we're back to Acts, by the way. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. And we know that Luke's tagging along.
Yep.
And Luke is tagging along, obviously. Many scholars believe that Paul had an illness or infirmity, that Luke was his personal physician. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's definitely a
Luke's
plausible.
with him off and on until about chapter 20, and after 20, Luke is there.
Yeah, he's pretty steady with him. So Luke will be right with him to the end, and that's just, they become very loyal missionary companions. Gratefully, Luke obviously gets a lot of history because he writes one of the Gospels and this book of Acts.
And there's a lot of scholars that believe that the 2 years that Paul is going to be in Rome and Luke is with him, it's while his case and is being developed in for a trial that Nero is going to shortchange. The trial's never actually.
Well, it is Nero.
Yeah, but the point is that Luke is there. And he's assembling all this information in Rome with Paul, and that's why Luke can write the whole
Testimony.
story here.
Yeah, it's incredible. The shipwreck narrative has more words assigned to it by Luke than are found in the entire Genesis account in the Scripture. So, the shipwreck narrative, Luke is very detailed in his
He's a
description.
physician.
Yeah, he's a physician. He's taken his shorthand or whatever it is, entire Genesis account. So Luke's amazing detail includes everything from the vessel's nautical heading, the type of storm, the ship's direction of drift, geological markers on Malta, reef configurations, and even the depth of the seafloor. I mean, that's a lot of detail that Luke puts in this account. It's kind of fascinating to me why that's necessary. And to this moment, I don't think anything gets into Scripture accidentally. So we have great challenge here to figure out why all this stuff is there. And I have to confess, I haven't done that yet.
Well, they can, from the descriptions that we have in the New Testament, they know where the
where it is.
occurred.
Yeah, I'm
It's
going
in
to get
Malta.
there.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
actually going to get there.
All right.
So every detail, including every man on board, including Paul's survived, is included. So he actually tells how many, 276. People.
And when we were talking about the 153 fish and everything, and
yeah,
the
there's gotta be-
276, we learned that those are both triangular numbers. They're both in that series of numbers that is a cubed number
Pyramid style number.
Yes, and I think it's down to the detail, down to the gematria or the meaning of the numbers.
Some of this
it's
stuff
all there.
I have
It's
to
all
confess, I haven't spent the time to get the deeper meaning, and that's not like me. Usually I do, but I have been very busy in temporal affairs these days.
So if you just would summarize it in a nutshell without doing the hours and hours of study on those numbers, like crazy people like me have done, those numbers are a symbol of an exponential harvest increase.
The growth. Yeah,
right.
I love
And
that.
so remember that what does the angel tell him about that number, the number of people on the ship? You'll save them all.
They all get,
All.
All, yes, absolutely.
Again, and remember
none of them perish.
Right.
But that's a whole faith-building story coming up here.
And it goes along with the Sermon on the Mount and the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. There's enough for all and extra.
And then some.
The Lord never, ever turns down someone who needs to be healed. There's more than enough and exponentially
And we're speaking
enough
spiritually saved.
power for Jesus
Right.
to save.
Exactly.
So again, these are the saved.
Absolutely. Okay, and so the storm they run into is so serious that they can't see the stars for many days, and they don't appear, and it's no small tempest lay upon us. All that we should hope and saved was taken away, meaning they're feeling pretty hopeless. And the sun was blocked, and that's what they used to navigate, so they just had no clue. They're just out there running blind and just wondering if they're even going to survive. You're smiling.
Yeah, I just love the way the Lord directs Paul. You know what? I mean, the visions are great, but then the next direction that we have is
Just get
we're
lost at sea.
dying in a storm, or we're
Yeah. So it's
being
sometimes
beaten
he
up in a
doesn't know
synagogue,
exactly
or-
how it's going to go down, but he's just willing and able on every count.
and do we trust the Lord in that?
Well, and that's the whole kicker.
No matter.
When we're lost in a storm, it's hard to. Sometimes we get in that place where we just don't quite trust. We're like, oh man, where am I going?
And the Lord's just like, I got you just where I want you. Just roll with this,
Yeah, exactly. So here they are. They're lost at sea, and he says. Then Paul gets, he has the vision, another one, and he says, "And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life amongst you, but of the ship. The ship's going to go down, but you're all going to be okay." That's pretty incredible in there. And they stood by me in the night, and the angel of God, whose I am and who I serve. For there stood by me, the angel of God. Anyway, so he's saying I had a vision, and they told me, hey, we're all going to live. The boat's going to be a mess, but we're all going to live. And so saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all of them that sail with thee. So he's saying, you're going to make it to Rome, and you're going to testify in front of Caesar. But the boat's lost, and I have a detour for you. And it's coming up here. We have a little side job on the way.
What about that promise? The God hath given thee all of them that sail with thee. It's back to what we said in the beginning, If you're the jailer of Paul, you get converted. If you're the guard of the prisoners on the ship, you get converted. If you're the leader of the synagogue next door, he's just such a powerful witness of Jesus Christ.
And then he bears testimony of what the angel tells him. Wherefore, sir, be of good cheer, for I believe, or sirs, I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So he's saying, hey, God said it, so let it be written, so let it be done. No, anyway, what I'm saying is, it's just, he has no doubt in all of these services that he's doing. He's just very comfortable in the fact he's in God's hand.
Do we believe in our blessings? Do we believe in our patriarchal blessings? Do we believe all that God has told us?
And I don't know about all of you, but there's times when I believe, but I'm like, how's this going to happen? I mean, and maybe my belief is not as courageous as it could be, but it's learning to be. That's what I find as you walk through life and you walk through your path of Scripture and you see the goodness of God and you see the majesty of His Word, especially with all the blessings that God has put upon me and us in teaching us things, it becomes very, very easy to see His hand, and your faith grows with every passing story.
I know we've said it before, but one of my favorite sayings is, the Lord finds 1,000 ways every day to ask you the same question. Do you trust me?
Yeah. And you can answer that every day too, that sometimes we're a little more trusting than others. No, but anyway, I think that for me, the hard part for me often isn't trusting Him, it's trusting me. So, we get into a place sometimes we don't trust ourselves in our discernment or whatever the case might be. But we need to develop, like the 6th lecture on faith says, we need to develop the faith necessary by that which we commit, which Paul did. By the things that he sacrificed, he became absolutely founded in faith. Okay, so this little path in the red here is his wild journey coming across the Mediterranean,
that way.
And the shipwrecks. He ends up shipwrecked on Malta.
That is true. His 4th missionary journey would not have been a straight line sailing across the sea. They'd have been tacking back and forth.
He's dealing with all kinds of things, and they end up shipwrecked on Malta. and in this journey as he passes through here.
Oh, though, too, Paul warns them that not to go and go out in the storm and everything. And when you think about it, Paul is no novice sailor. I mean,
He's been on a boat quite a bit.
Several journeys,
Yeah.
he warned them, and they did it anyway, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so, howbeit, we must cast upon a certain island. So he's saying, even though all this has happened, we're gonna be on this island. And so when the sailors heard the waves crashing and they knew they were going to be in shallow water, the helmsman commanded them to find the depth, and they do their sounding and they find the depths and drop it overboard, and they find it 120 fathoms, and then they drop it
120
again.
feet.
I'm sorry,
20
feet.
fathoms.
20 fathoms, you're right. And then they do it again, and it's 90 feet or 15 fathoms, and the captain of the ship knew that they were approaching land and gave the order to drop 4 anchors from the stern. Now, how often, when you're in a panic, do you drop all your anchors? Wait a minute, got to think about this.
True.
So we drop everything we got to stabilize us, and we just need to stop back and take a look. And that's kind of what happens in the boat. And so they drop all the anchors, and they're just anchored there, and the weather is beating them up still. And the grain fighters would be the grain freighters would be approximately 12 foot long, made entirely of wood. This is the anchor stock, and the crossbar of the anchor would have been made of solid lead. And the wood would have, over the years, decayed in the sea and not survived, but the lead crossbars would have lasted indefinitely. And the reason that's important is we can actually find this stuff, and they did. They actually found it and moved it to a museum. And that's pretty cool, because we have archaeological evidence.
You mean the Bible's true?
Yeah, it's like it really happened or something, It's
Just checking.
But that's part of the fun part of the archaeology. But when you go down here and you see it all, and the anchors are there, it's like Paul says they got to cut themselves loose and just trust themselves. And that's kind of meaning they have to just trust that they're going to make it here. And these anchors that they cut loose are now in a museum on Malta and have been inspected by the professors and foremost experts. And anyway, they found these anchors, and so they do know that it actually happened on Malta and the shipwreck. And so that's a documented fact. So we know that Paul's story is authentic, and it's been authenticated. You got that look.
Well, I documented fact. There's debate over, if it's the real anchor or not.
Yeah.
It does
There's always
fit
doubters.
all the text, yes.
Okay. For me, it's a documented, authentic. It's acceptable evidence for me. Let's put it that way. Okay. So the ship, when we're about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under the color, as though it would have been cast anchors out for the foreship. And Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except they abide in the ship, you cannot survive. So he says, stay with the ship. And the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let it fall off. Or in essence, they let the outer parts all come loose so that they're free of them. And then he asks them all to eat and take some meat, because they've been basically trying to survive without food for the while.
Well, I think they've been a little unable to keep anything down.
Probably so.
I don't think I'd be eating.
And for this is for your health, for they shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. So he's given thanks in the midst of all this turmoil. And they were all of good cheer, and they took some meat, and and we were in all about the ship 216 souls. So there's your 276 people. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. That's got to be a brave thing to do. Cast the wheat, cast the rest of the food. Virtually, they stripped the ship down so that it would be lighter. and in their journey, they're in this reef out just off of Malta again. We're back to this map. And in the reef, I thought it was the next slide, but it's not. And when the day they knew not land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, and that which they had in mind, and it were possible to thrust the ship into this lagoon or place. And Luke describes the location of Paul's shipwreck as being in front of a bay within a beach. Since most of Malta is coastline, is cliff area, the vast majority of the search area can be quickly eliminated. Luke describes this bay with a beach as having a reef in front of it where the two seas collide. And there's actually evidence right here that this is the place we're talking about on Malta with that reef right there. You can see in that upper picture. And anyway, so they pretty well know where this is, and this area where the two seas collide, right in front of it, we know that that's where the boat first had a problem.
And then you also have ancient churches there that claim to be where
Right.
Paul had shipwrecked.
So all of this information is really fascinating to factuate the journey. But the part that's incredible to me is the faith he's telling them, hey, you guys are all going to be okay. And virtually they end up beaching the boat on the reef. They end up making for shore from there. And when they'd taken up the anchors, they committed themselves to the sea and loosed the rubber bands and hoisted up the mainsail into the wind and made towards shore. Taken up or cut the anchor, they left them in the sea. And the details in the narrative enable the Greek maritime authorities using the navigational computer software to assist in locating the anchors, which is kind of fun. And they, like I said, they have them in a museum there in Malta. And when they had taken up there, they committed themselves to the sea, which we just said, and head towards shore. And falling into place where the two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart struck fast and remained unmovable, but the hind part was broken with the violence of the waves. So they virtually, the ship is lost, like they said, and they all have to make a swim for it.
That's an incredible prophecy that everyone on the ship is going to survive and the ship is going to be decimated. How does that happen, right?
It's beached on a reef, right?
Right. Well, an angel of the Lord said so. That's why. But yeah.
So much evidence here of how this all took place, and we have very much evidence of the whole journey. That being,
I like the other map where it's got all the zigzags.
the tacking into the wind.
Right.
I just appreciate the historical part of this record, even though, you always look for the spiritual message in the record, which is the faith and the visions of Paul. But in all of this, the sheer historical account that they actually make it across there, and he actually does make it to Rome after such a harrowing experience,
Right.
is pretty amazing. And that seems to be the pattern of God in all things. I mean, when you think about the children of Israel coming down through the wilderness canyon and being trapped against the sea, and everything the Lord does seems to be that last minute save.
Right.
And I got a suspicion that's about to happen again. That last minute save for God's people, assuming, that we make covenant to be his people, then we do have that last minute save. Now, the fascinating part is about all this is that Peter and Paul almost mirror each other's mission, and we've talked about this.
Yeah, but this is a good time to
Good
review it right here. Yeah.
Peter meets Paul in Antioch. Peter visits the churches in northern Asia Minor. Evidence of Peter in Corinth. He wrote his first letter to Babylon, or from Babylon. Peter was executed in Rome, just like Paul. Mark wrote his Gospels in Rome just after Peter's death. So we have that history. The parallels is just amazing, other than one's a little more to the Jews, and the other one's a little more to the Gentiles. Even though they cross over somewhat, there's still the bulk of Paul's mission is toward. He's called as the apostle to the Gentiles.
And I do believe that Luke is doing these parallels intentionally to show that they're both teaching the same gospel, and they're both going forth during this time of the Gentiles to two different sets of people, the
Right.
Jews in Jerusalem and to the Gentiles.
Like Peter goes out to Samaria, Paul goes out to Rome. Words rejected by the Jews of the homeland, words rejected by the Jews of the dispersa. Peter's in prison, Paul's in prison. Judgment on Herod, judgment on the Jews. These things are just the parallels of their two missions are incredible.
Really quickly, the judgment on the Jews there, I just want to read this part because it's so encapsulating of Paul's ministry. Because here in the very end, when he's in Rome and he's telling everyone and bearing his testimony and proving to them, both out of the law of Moses and out of the prophets, that Jesus is the Christ. And then those that refuse, he says, "Be it known therefore unto you that the salvation of God is sent to the Gentiles, and they will hear it."
And that is our blessing. I mean, we actually are partakers
Right.
because of that.
Yeah, Paul's going to nail that in Romans when we get there.
And we get a little arrogant sometimes, and we think that they're lost.
Well, we replaced them.
Yeah, we replace them, and that's just not true. We'll get to that in Romans.
Yeah, that's what I said. When we get to
that in
Romans 11, that's
we're
big
going
right
to get
there.
to a lot of things in later on. The one thing I thought was really fascinating, and we talk about replacement theology, but the truth of it is, Paul still honored the holy days.
Well,
All the way through his life, he still honored the holy
Yes.
days. And so too often we think,
he didn't convert to being a Gentile.
yeah, we think that everything's done away, but what's done away was the ritual performances,
Right.
the ritual rites and performances. But God doesn't command anything that's empty and void.
Right.
So the reason he commanded those holy days to be honored is their prophetic nature. And that's what I think is so overlooked by so many of us, is we so often don't realize that the appointed times, or the feasts as they're called in Leviticus, are his appointment book. And in a cyclical pattern of rehearsal.
And when you understand that, things just start to open up. I
Absolutely.
mean, that was one of the keys to understanding how Daniel's numbers work.
So this is the prison in Rome where Paul most likely would have resided. And of course we have Emperor Nero there. And he ends up, before he actually goes on that journey, he ends up before he gets on the boat actually that we just talked about, he actually sits in front of actually Herod Agrippa. And this is the story we'll often hear where Herod Agrippa actually says, almost converteth me to be a Jew.
Oh, this is clear back before he even got on
Goes
the boat, the
Yep,
journey.
We're stepping back a little, not to Acts 26.
This
here.
would be when Roman soldier has rescued him from the Jews at the temple that wanted to kill him, and the Roman soldier finds out that he's Roman, and then he's like, "Okay, you need to be before a Roman court."
So I'm a little out of order here.
Right.
But,
So they're bringing him in front of King Agrippa because he's a Roman citizen.
in Caesarea
Right.
area. Anyway, and he says, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest, meaning he's obviously the king of the Jews. He's the king of that providence. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. meaning you guys got me tied up, and I don't wish that on anybody. But
Just like Agabus said, by the way.
oh, absolutely. So the prophecy of Agabus was true. And, in all of this, I guess where I'm going in this thing is even though Agrippa, I guess, says, you almost persuadeth me, I think that's kind of an empty and hollow statement for him. Even because he's kind of intellectually, Paul is very good, but his heart is far from honest of heart, and he's far from a broken heart and a contrite spirit. So we kind of see that, and he's almost there, but lost. And he knew and believed the facts about Jesus, but he had no inner burning or testimony about it. Faith, which does not obey, is not enough. Meaning, and I think that's a bad word. Belief, faith almost implies action.
I'll show you my faith by
yeah,
your works. And
I don't think faith implies just belief. Belief is, just you can say, that makes sense, or I think that's kind of where. But he definitely was not prepared to sacrifice anything for it, not his position or anything. He's not going to stick his neck out on the line. James says the demons believe that much, meaning the demons can believe things, but that doesn't mean anything, The demons believe. The devils believe, per se. You must have faith and obedience, and I sometimes think we have a tendency to not connect faith with works directly because of the big debate between Christians and whoever else.
Grace versus
but
works, yeah.
But the truth of it is that which you have faith you act on. If you believe your car is going to take you home, you get into the car and drive it home, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. That faith which comes out in just the doing. If you say you believe something and don't act upon it, you really
don't believe
it. Yeah, what I'm saying is, or you just have no discipline, or whatever the case is, which we all wrestle with that from time to time. So in Luke 14:25 through 33, if any man cometh unto me and hateth not his own father and mother, and wife and children and brother and sister, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now that's harsh words, because the translators use the word hateth not. And I think what he's really trying to say is, if you choose father, mother, wife, children, brother or sister, yea, or your own life, if you choose that over, it's not hateth as we would think of hateth. Whosoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. That means that we have to act. Our faith we have to get in the car and drive home, so to speak. We have to do it, or you really don't believe. I mean, if you believe, you're going to do it. It's as simple as that. For which of you desireth to build a tower and doth not first sit down and count the cost, whether ye have wherewith to complete it? Now, I have been guilty of not always. Sometimes I go on faith and end up struggling to complete it, but but we get there anyway. Least happily, when he hath laid the foundation, he is not able to finish. Not all that behold begin to mock him, all that behold begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, as he goeth to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and take counsel whether he is able to withstand, or to with 10,000 men meet him that cometh against him with 20,000. In other words, you gotta have a little wisdom here.
Strategy.
Or else, while the other is yet great far off, he sendeth out an ambassador and asketh conditions of peace. In other words, if you're outmatched, you sue for peace and you try to find where can I meet you somewhere in the middle here. So therefore, whatsoever he be of you that renounceth not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. That's pretty bold. Sometimes I think we are pretty, wishy-washy?
Fair weather committed.
Fair weather committed. So the first, sit down and count the cost. Have you counted the cost? What might it cost me? Following Christ may cost you your family relationships. Many of us who've grown up in the circles of Mormondom, I'm not supposed to say it that way.
I don't know how you would say that.
Anyway, who have grown up close to the vine, I'm going to say, or whatever, we don't have that test as often as out in the missionary field, but I think we're getting more. I think the adversary has worked its way into the center stake of Zion, and we are struggling big time in our family relationships. We're losing kids, people losing their testimonies everywhere. So, you have to ask yourself, do you believe enough to stand up against the ridicule? My mother and my father may be hurt or mad if I obey. That's happened in many of our lives. It happened a little in Rhonda's life. My family may reject me for putting Christ first. Man, I tell you what, I have even sometimes children who question me putting Christ first. And that's a heartbreak, a very big heartbreak in my life, personally. Following Christ will cost you hardship in life. Living as a Christian means you have to overcome your lusts, and you might not be as popular if you're a strict observer of Christ. You're not going to be able to walk the middle of the road. It costs you in material things sometimes. Giving to the Lord as I should will cost too much, In fact, you find in most of these early apostles, they gave it all. They really had nothing except for the clothes on their back, and many, many times would just go out on faith, like the lilies of the field. Paul is a prime example. He would go out and he would work places. It's kind of a work mission along the way. He tried to take care of himself, but he did not. He did not ever accumulate wealth, as we would often think. So those things are always there. Does God really expect me to give for all of these things? And the answer is yes. We believe that we consecrate our very lives to Him if we want to be like Him. Now, you can be middle of the road, I guess. Many people choose to be middle of the road. But, it's important that we make our faith sure.
I'm just thinking of Paul's words that it's better to give than receive.
Yeah. So it's definitely a life of service, and that, what? You learn to love it. And I think that too often we have become very materialistic and material-minded. Okay, following Christ will cost you time. You got Sunday mornings, and some nights is too much for some people. For me, I actually have learned to love given the time. In fact, I kind of get upset when I have to be a little too focused other places. So I wanted to spend more time with these things. I've become very much a lover of the word and sharing the word. I definitely, I hope I'm becoming more like Paul in that regard, in all these things. You mean I must study, meditate, and pray every day? The answer is you get to study, meditate, and pray every day. It's not that you must; it becomes a joy.
Well, the scriptures, when you study them enough that you can start linking things together, and it starts to come alive, and it becomes a treasure hunt. it gets to be that you feel like you're starving if you can't get in there.
Yes, absolutely. So serving Christ will affect your whole life. It's a whole different way of thinking and living. Have you considered the cost of not following Christ? There's the question. Do you want to follow him? And I coined a phrase not too long ago, and I'm going to end with this phrase because it's become kind of my best way I know to capstone the prayer I feel these days. And that is, I pray all the time that his love will win in me. And that's where I'm kind of at. I want his love to win my soul. And
Amen.
you'll take away the weaknesses of the flesh. So, with that, God bless. Grateful to have shared with you as best we could the love Paul had for the Lord and his undying zeal to serve him. May we walk with him to the Lord.
Amen.
Thank you.